Man. This justice must be rendered to the police of that period, that even in the most serious public junctures, it imperturbably fulfilled its duties connected with the sewers and surveillance. A revolt was, in its eyes, no pretext for allowing malefactors to take the bit in their own mouths, and for neglecting society for the reason that the government was in peril. The ordinary service was performed correctly in company with the extraordinary service, and was not troubled by the latter. In the midst of an incalculable political event already begun, under the pressure of a possible revolution, a police agent spun a thief without allowing himself to be distracted by insurrection and barricades. It was something precisely parallel which took place on the afternoon of the 6th of June on the banks of the Seine, on the slope of the right shore, a little beyond the Pont des Invalides. There is no longer any bank there now. The aspect of the locality has changed. On that bank, two men, separated by a certain distance, seemed to be watching each other while mutually avoiding each other. The one who was in advance was trying to get away, the one in the rear was trying to overtake the other. It was like a game of checkers played at a distance and in silence. Neither seemed to be in any hurry, and both walked slowly, as though each of them feared by too much haste to make his partner redouble his pace. One would have said that it was an appetite following its prey, and purposely without wearing the air of doing so. The prey was crafty and on its guard. The proper relations between the hunted polecat and the hunting dog were observed. The one who was seeking to escape had an insignificant mien and not an impressive appearance. The one who was seeking to seize him was rude of aspect, and must have been rude to encounter. The first, conscious that he was the more feeble, avoided the second. But he avoided him in a manner which was deeply furious. Anyone who could have observed him would have discerned in his eyes the somber hostility of flight, and all the menace that fear contains. The shore was deserted. There were no passers-by. Not even a boatman nor a lighterman was in the skiffs which were moored here and there. It was not easy to see these two men, except from the quay opposite, and to any person who had scrutinized them at that distance. The man who was in advance would have appeared like a bristling, tattered, and equivocal being, who was uneasy and trembling beneath a ragged blouse, and the other like a classic and official personage, wearing the frock coat of authority buttoned to the chin. Perchance the reader might recognize these two men, if he were to see them closer at hand. What was the object of the second man? Probably to succeed in clothing the first more warmly. When a man clothed by the state pursues a man in rags, it is in order to make of him a man who is also clothed by the state. Only, the whole question lies in the color. To be dressed in blue is glorious. To be dressed in red is disagreeable. There is a purple from below. It is probably some unpleasantness and some purple of the sort which the first man is desirous of shirking. If the other allowed him to walk on, and had not seized him as yet, it was, judging from all appearances, in the hope of seeing him lead up to some significant meeting place and to some group worth catching. This delicate operation is called spinning. What renders this conjecture entirely probable is that the buttoned-up man, on catching sight from the shore of a hackney coach on the quay as it was passing along empty, made a sign to the driver. The driver understood, evidently recognized the person with whom he had to deal, turned about and began to follow the two men at the top of the quay, at a foot pace. This was not observed by the slouching and tattered personage who was in advance. The hackney coach rolled along the trees of the Champs-Élysées. The bust of the driver, whip in hand, could be seen moving along above the parapet. One of the secret instructions of the police authorities to their agents contains this article: always have on hand a hackney coach, in case of emergency. While these two men were maneuvering, each on his own side, with irreproachable strategy, they approached an inclined plane on the quay which descended to the shore, and which permitted cab drivers arriving from Passy to come to the river and water their horses. This inclined plane was suppressed later on, for the sake of symmetry. Horses may die of thirst, but the eye is gratified. It is probable that the man in the blouse had intended to ascend this inclined plane. with a view to making his escape into the Champs-Élysées, a place ornamented with trees, but, in return, much infested with policemen, and where the other could easily exercise violence. This point on the quay is not very far distant from the house brought to Paris from Marat in 1824, by Colonel Braque, and designated as the House of François I. A guardhouse is situated close at hand. To the great surprise of his watcher, the man who was being tracked did not mount by the inclined plane for watering. He continued to advance along the quay on the shore. His position was visibly becoming critical. What was he intending to do, if not to throw himself into the Seine? Henceforth, there existed no means of ascending to the quay. There was no other inclined plane, no staircase. And they were near the spot, marked by the bend in the Seine towards the Pont de Jena, where the bank, growing constantly narrower, ended in a slender tongue, and was lost in the water. There he would inevitably find himself blocked between the perpendicular wall on his right, the river on his left and in front of him, and the authorities on his heels. It is true that this termination of the shore was hidden from sight by a heap of rubbish 6 or 7 feet in height, produced by some demolition or other. But did this man hope to conceal himself effectually behind that heap of rubbish, which one need but skirt? The expedient would have been puerile. He certainly was not dreaming of such a thing. The innocence of thieves does not extend to that point. The pile of rubbish formed a sort of projection at the water's edge, which was prolonged in a promontory as far as the wall of the quay. The man who was being followed arrived at this little mound and went round it, so that he ceased to be seen by the other. The latter, as he did not see, could not be seen. He took advantage of this fact to abandon all dissimulation and to walk very rapidly. In a few moments, he had reached the rubbish heap and passed round it. There he halted in sheer amazement. The man whom he had been pursuing was no longer there. Total eclipse of the man in the blouse. The shore, beginning with the rubbish heap, was only about 30 paces long, then it plunged into the water which beat against the wall of the quay. The fugitive could not have thrown himself into the Seine without being seen by the man who was following him. What had become of him? The man in the buttoned-up coat walked to the extremity of the shore, and remained there in thought for a moment, his fists clenched, his eyes searching. All at once he smote his brow. He had just perceived, at the point where the land came to an end and the water began, a large iron grating, low, arched, garnished with a heavy lock and with 3 massive hinges. This grating, a sort of door pierced at the base of the quay, opened on the river as well as on the shore. A blackish stream passed under it. This stream discharged into the Seine. Beyond the heavy, rusty iron bars, a sort of dark and vaulted corridor could be descried. The man folded his arms and stared at the grating with an air of reproach. As this gaze did not suffice, he tried to thrust it aside. He shook it, it resisted solidly. It is probable that it had just been opened, although no sound had been heard, a singular circumstance in so rusty a grating. But it is certain that it had been closed again. This indicated that the man before whom that door had just opened had not a hook but a key. This evidence suddenly burst upon the mind of the man who was trying to move the grating, and evoked from him this indignant ejaculation. "That is too much. A government key." Then, immediately regaining his composure, he expressed a whole world of interior ideas by this outburst of monosyllables accented almost ironically. "Come. Come. Come. Come." That said. And in the hope of something or other, either that he should see the man emerge or other men enter, he posted himself on the watch behind a heap of rubbish, with the patient rage of a pointer. The hackney coach, which regulated all its movements on his, had, in its turn, halted on the quay above him, close to the parapet. The coachman, foreseeing a prolonged wait, encased his horse's muzzles in the bag of oats which is damp at the bottom, and which is so familiar to Parisians, to whom, be it said in parenthesis, the government sometimes applies it. The rare passers-by on the Pont de Jena turned their heads. Before they pursued their way, to take a momentary glance at these two motionless items in the landscape, the man on the shore, the carriage on the quay. Chapter 4. He also bears his cross. Jean Valjean had resumed his march and had not again paused. This march became more and more laborious. The level of these vaults varies. The average height is about 5 feet, 6 inches, and has been calculated for the stature of a man. Jean Valjean was forced to bend over, in order not to strike Marius against the vault. At every step he had to bend, then to rise, and to feel incessantly of the wall. The moisture of the stones, and the viscous nature of the timber framework furnished but poor supports to which to cling, either for hand or foot. He stumbled along in the hideous dung heap of the city. The intermittent gleams from the air holes only appeared at very long intervals, and were so wan that the full sunlight seemed like the light of the moon. All the rest was mist, miasma, opaqueness, blackness. Jean Valjean was both hungry and thirsty. Especially thirsty. And this, like the sea, was a place full of water where a man cannot drink. His strength, which was prodigious, as the reader knows, and which had been but little decreased by age, thanks to his chaste and sober life, began to give way, nevertheless. Fatigue began to gain on him. And as his strength decreased, it made the weight of his burden increase. Marius, who was, perhaps, dead, weighed him down as inert bodies weigh. Jean Valjean held him in such a manner that his chest was not oppressed, and so that respiration could proceed as well as possible. Between his legs he felt the rapid gliding of the rats. One of them was frightened to such a degree that he bit him. From time to time, a breath of fresh air reached him through the vent holes of the mouths of the sewer, and reanimated him. It might have been 3 hours past midday when he reached the belt sewer. He was, at first, astonished at this sudden widening. He found himself, all at once, in a gallery where his outstretched hands could not reach the two walls, and beneath a vault which his head did not touch. The grand sewer is, in fact, 8 feet wide and 7 feet high. At the point where the Montmartre sewer joins the grand sewer, 2 other subterranean galleries, that of the Rue de Provence, and that of the abattoir, form a square. Between these 4 ways, a less sagacious man would have remained undecided. Jean Valjean selected the broadest, that is to say, the belt sewer. But here the question again came up, should he descend or ascend? He thought that the situation required haste, and that he must now gain the Seine at any risk. In other terms, he must descend. He turned to the left. It was well that he did so. For it is an error to suppose that the belt sewer has 2 outlets. The one in the direction of Bercy, the other towards Passy, and that it is, as its name indicates, the subterranean girdle of the Paris on the right bank. The grand sewer. Which is, it must be remembered, nothing else than the old brook of Menilmontant. Terminates, if one ascends it, in a blind sack, that is to say, at its ancient point of departure which was its source, at the foot of the knoll of Menilmontant. There is no direct communication with the branch which collects the waters of Paris beginning with the Quartier Popincourt, and which falls into the Seine through the Amelet sewer above the ancient Isle Louviers. This branch, which completes the collecting sewer, is separated from it, under the Rue Menilmontant itself, by a pile which marks the dividing point of the waters, between upstream and downstream. If Jean Valjean had ascended the gallery he would have arrived, after 1,000 efforts, and broken down with fatigue, and in an expiring condition, in the gloom, at a wall. He would have been lost. In case of necessity. By retracing his steps a little way. And entering the passage of the Fils du Calvaire. On condition that he did not hesitate at the subterranean crossing of the Carrefour Beaucret. And by taking the corridor St. Louis. Then the St. Gilles Gut on the left. Then turning to the right and avoiding the St. Sebastian Gallery. He might have reached the Amelet sewer, and thence, provided that he did not go astray in the sort of F which lies under the Bastille, he might have attained the outlet on the Seine near the arsenal. But in order to do this, he must have been thoroughly familiar with the enormous madrepore of the sewer in all its ramifications and in all its openings. Now, we must again insist that he knew nothing of that frightful drain which he was traversing. And had anyone asked him in what he was, he would have answered, in the night. His instinct served him well. To descend was, in fact, possible safety. He left on his right the two narrow passages which branch out in the form of a claw under the Rue Lafitte and the Rue Saint-Georges, and the long, bifurcated corridor of the Chaussée d'Antin. A little beyond an affluent, which was, probably, the Madeleine branch, he halted. He was extremely weary. A passably large air-hole, probably the manhole in the Rue d'Anjou, furnished a light that was almost vivid. Jean Valjean, with the gentleness of movement which a brother would exercise towards his wounded brother, deposited Marius on the banquette of the sewer. Marius' blood-stained face appeared under the wan light of the air-hole like the ashes at the bottom of a tomb. His eyes were closed, his hair was plastered down on his temples like a painter's brushes dried in red wash. His hands hung limp and dead. A clot of blood had collected in the knot of his cravat. His limbs were cold, and blood was clotted at the corners of his mouth. His shirt had thrust itself into his wounds, the cloth of his coat was chafing the yawning gashes in the living flesh. Jean Valjean, pushing aside the garments with the tips of his fingers, laid his hand upon Marius' breast. His heart was still beating. Jean Valjean tore up his shirt, bandaged the young man's wounds as well as he was able and stopped the flowing blood. Then bending over Marius, who still lay unconscious and almost without breathing, in that half-light, he gazed at him with inexpressible hatred. On disarranging Marius' garments, he had found two things in his pockets, the roll which had been forgotten there on the preceding evening, and Marius' pocketbook. He ate the roll and opened the pocketbook. On the first page he found the 4 lines written by Marius. The reader will recall them. My name is Marius Pontmercy. Carry my body to my grandfather, M. Gilliner Mand, Rue de Fils du Calvaire, No. 6, in the Marais. Jean Valjean read these 4 lines by the light of the air-hole, and remained for a moment as though absorbed in thought, repeating in a low tone. Rue de Fils du Calvaire, number 6, Monsieur Gilliner Mand. He replaced the pocketbook in Marius' pocket. He had eaten, his strength had returned to him. He took Marius up once more upon his back, placed the latter's head carefully on his right shoulder, and resumed his descent of the sewer. The Grand Sewer, directed according to the course of the valley of Menilmontant, is about 2 leagues long. It is paved throughout a notable portion of its extent. This torch of the names of the streets of Paris, with which we are illuminating for the reader Jean Valjean's subterranean march, Jean Valjean himself did not possess. Nothing told him what zone of the city he was traversing, nor what way he had made. Only the growing pallor of the pools of light which he encountered from time to time indicated to him that the sun was withdrawing from the pavement, and that the day would soon be over. And the rolling of vehicles overhead, having become intermittent instead of continuous, then having almost ceased, he concluded that he was no longer under central Paris, and that he was approaching some solitary region, in the vicinity of the outer boulevards, or the extreme outer quays. Where there are fewer houses and streets, the sewer has fewer air holes. The gloom deepened around Jean Valjean. Nevertheless, he continued to advance, groping his way in the dark. Suddenly this darkness became terrible.